Resident Evil as a franchise has underwent many different changes, periods and eras over the course of its 30-year history. And with how complex and convoluted games development can be, it's not unheard of for games to be either scrapped or cancelled entirely. Which is exactly what I'll be delving into in today's video, as I present to you the cancelled Resident Evil games iceberg. This is the biggest iceberg to be featured on the channel yet, with 20 entries held within its many layers. Resident Evil's history with scrapped and cancelled games is an interesting one. This iceberg features games that were cancelled nearly 30 years ago, along with games that just recently got the can. So in a way, we will see the evolution of the Resident Evil franchise just through exploring this iceberg. There are two main types of games that are featured within this iceberg, those being half versions and cancelled games. Half versions are cancelled prototypes of actually released RE games. For example, Resident Evil 3.5 is a scrapped version of RE4 and so on. And of course, cancelled games are titles that never came to be at all. The 0.5 versions are some of the most known cancelled games on this iceberg. However, as we go deeper and deeper within its layers, I'm sure you will find some cancelled RE games you've never heard of before. So please, join me as we look into the entire history of cancelled Resident Evil games explained. And as always, we will start at layer 1, the Sky, which features the most commonly known cancelled Resident Evil games. RE 3.5 Hookman. This is perhaps one of the most infamous cancelled Resident Evil games of all time. RE 3.5, commonly known as the Hookman demo, is the prototype version of Resident Evil 4. Interestingly enough, this entry isn't related to just one cancelled version of RE4, as there was 4 separate versions all developed and scrapped at different stages, which as it stands sees Resident Evil 4 while having some of the messiest and most convoluted development for the franchise. It all began shortly after the release of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, as development for the next Resident Evil game would begin, dubbed RE 3.5. And from its very concept, Capcom had very big plans for this title, as they were feeling fatigue from the same old fixed camera, slow moving zombie releases of the 90s. The next Resident Evil needed to be something big, new, bold and exciting. However, seemingly some of the devs at Capcom took this change in pace a bit too literally, as the first prototype version of RE4, dubbed RE 3.5 Stylish, would be a huge departure from the series altogether. This version of RE4 was set to be directed by RE2's director Hideki Kamiya, with him recently having great success with RE2's release. Shortly after the announcement of the PS2, Kamiya was assigned to work on a brand new Resident Evil game for the hardware. However, this iteration of RE4 was too drastic of a shift for the franchise, as it would feature a brand new character, Tony Redgrave, who was actually the son of Oswald E. Spencer. Not only this, but Tony also possesses superhuman powers. As for this game's gameplay, while designing the title, Kamiya felt that protagonists in Resident Evil games with fixed cameras didn't look cool enough during battle. To rectify this, Kamiya wanted to add a dynamic camera system along with ditching pre-rendered backgrounds, and it was also said that this game would be very action focused. However, with this new protagonist and very non-Resident Evil gameplay, the title was a radical departure from the traditional Resident Evil concepts of survival horror, and Shinji Mikami felt it was better suited as a different release. The project was shortly renamed Carnival before finally releasing as Devil May Cry. To remove any Resident Evil ties, much of the game's story was rewrote, along with Tony Redgrave as a character being replaced with Dante. And while Devil May Cry is now one of Capcom's biggest franchises, while DMC was a hit and great for Capcom, this wasn't the next big evolution of Resident Evil they were hoping for, so back to the drawing board it was for Capcom. Then in 2002, the first ever public trailer for Resident Evil 4 will be showcased, debuting at Tokyo Game Show 2002. The world would finally get a look at this brand new ambitious Resident Evil game, which was dubbed RE 3.5 Castle. This new RE title was headed by Hiroshi Shibata, who previously worked on the pre-rendered backgrounds in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. This new Resident Evil title showed a much darker tone and atmosphere than previous games, which is something I really enjoy. With the power of the GameCube's hardware, much more detailed textures, lighting effects, and character models can be seen here, as well as the game featuring fully 3D rendered environments, ditching the pre-rendered backgrounds the series had been tied to since its inception. This demo footage shows Leon S. Kennedy investigating a seemingly haunted or abandoned castle, as well as an airship location, which is another common nickname for this version of the game. In Leon's design here, we can see it closely resembles the released version of the game. showing how Capcom really wanted this particular look for Leon very early in development. During the trailer, Leon shoots at an off-screen threat multiple times, which is then shown as this amalgamation of black tentacles who are surrounded by a thick black fog. The significance in this creature is shown in this trailer, as it seeks to infect Leon with an unknown virus. This monster proved very troublesome for this game during development, as it was very taxing on the GameCube's hardware, as the console had a lot of trouble rendering this creature. To resolve this, Yasuhisa Kimura devised a different approach of enemies, which would be hallucinatory in nature. These were wrote into the script as the side effects of Leon's infection, which would serve as a stepping stone into the next iteration of RE 3.5. As for this castle demo's supposed plot, Leon's investigation would uncover the remains of an ancient underground civilization below the castle, where the progenitor virus, the mother of all Resident Evil viruses, was isolated within the body of a superhuman king, revealing that the Umbrella Corp's existence was a tool for Lord Spencer to achieve immortality. Like I mentioned, Leon would be infected by a virus which would slowly mutate through his body over the course of the game. Along the way, Leon was to meet up with a mysterious woman who was imprisoned within Umbrella's lab and experimented on. This woman was also accompanied by a trained BOW dog, and that is a very Resident Evil sounding plot, with some details from that sounding pretty familiar, like Leon meeting a mysterious woman and the gradual mutation of a virus in Leon's body. Both of these plot points would in some shape or form be in RE4. The script as a whole was passed off to a different team at Capcom, which would then become Haunting Ground. Concepts such as the castle setting and the woman being protected by a dog are the closest ties from that game to the scrapped version of RE4, which funny enough makes this the second game to release as a result of RE4's development. Following this castle version of the game, a further evolution of it will be shown a year later at Nintendo's E3 press conference. Franchise creator Shinji Mikami will present the announcement of multiple titles, all coming exclusively to the Nintendo GameCube system, although this was actually a communication error and wasn't true at all. The actual GameCube exclusive was Resident Evil 4, which, like I said, would receive a bold new look in this trailer. Revamped on from the castle demo, this version of Resident Evil 4 is the most infamous, as it has been dubbed the Hookman demo. And the first time we see this title, we can understand why it received the Hookman name, as a ghostly figure wielding a hook attacks and pursues Leon. Leon is then chased through a dimly lit and dilapidated house, with quick cuts and nauseating camera angles used to show that this wasn't your average zombie shooter. Shinji Mikami himself even claimed that this was a Resident Evil game scarier than you had ever seen before, along with the warning to not pee your pants. The game's tone and pace was a noticeably darker shift compared to even the castle demo, with Leon slowly exploring a dimly lit manor only to be faced with a ghostly enemy, which was dubbed by fans as the Hookman. The game also took on a far more psychological approach than ever seen in the series before. This was pitched by Yasuhisa Kawamura. He drew inspiration from the likes of John Carpenter's The Fog and Lost Souls as he put together this game's script. Outside of just the sound design and atmosphere, the game's camera style was a unique hybrid system that is partially indicative of the released version's over-the-shoulder style. While exploring this demo, the game's camera would start from a fixed perspective but shift and move as Leon did, similar to the Silent Hill franchise. However, when Leon would ready his weapon, the camera would then shift into an over-the-shoulder view, which adds a more intimate effect to the game's combat, with players being up close and personal to enemies as they approach Leon. Shown at that same E3 showcase, RE 3.5's Hookman will get a 5-minute gameplay demo, showcasing raw gameplay of Capcom's next survival horror adventure. Leon's design seems mostly unchanged from the first time we seen him, and to be honest, this may be one of my favourite Leon designs I have ever seen. I specifically like his jacket here. While it is the same sheepskin style bomber jacket RE4 would have, it appears here a much darker brown and looks far more bulkier, and I don't really know how to explain it, but this iteration of Leon just looks so much more badass than the original game's version. Not to say I don't love that Leon also, because I do. Appearances aside, the Hookman demo's atmosphere is just incredible. It has such a suffocating and isolating feel that aids its much scarier approach. I also really love the psychological elements this game's demo offers. For example, at a point in this trailer, a mounted deer head on the wall falls and begins to bleed and squirm around in pain, while emitting a deep growling sound. Further psychological elements can be seen in these suits of armor, which appear static but shoot to life and try to attack Leon as he passes by. A familiar enemy and concept that would actually appear in RE4. Other parts of this manor seem to attack Leon also, such as the fireplace spitting out flames as Leon attempts to pass by. I love how aggressive and hostile this house setting is, and it really puts the player on edge and never gives you a moment to rest. Leon also encounters a room full of children's dolls that once he is deep enough into the room, they suddenly spring to life and begin to scuttle towards Leon, attacking him with sharp objects. These psychological elements were accomplished through a pretty big technical feat, as in order to have these objects in the environment also act like enemies and jump scares, two of the same room will be loaded in at once on top of each other, one normal room and one hallucination room. This allowed players to trigger events like the dolls coming to life or the deer head falling simply by crossing an invisible checkpoint, removing any need for additional loading screens, which I'm certain would have killed any tension and build up that leads to these moments. Given that this is a short gameplay demo, it's expected that not all of the elements in it will be finalized. However, I found that the game's ambient sounds, such as rain, thunder, and fire, and even gunshot sound effects, seem to be taken from the recently released Resident Evil 1 remake, which shows just how much I have played that game. The gameplay demo's conclusion comes with the introduction of a real threat to Leon, as a ghostly figure manifests from a painting wielding a hook in one hand. This enemy will be the infamous Hookman, a fan favourite in the RE community, and instantly, the Hookman demonstrates how different he is to your typical Resident Evil enemy, as he is impervious to Leon's firearms. Shooting the ghost does nothing but land Leon a hook to the neck. When attacked by the Hookman, a really cool scrap mechanic can be seen, as players need to complete a series of quicktime events in order to push back the ghost. And these contextual quicktime events are a really intuitive gameplay mechanic that I really enjoy. This sharp flurry of quicktime events looks pretty tough to pull off on a whim, and it makes it really feel like Leon is in a desperate struggle to survive against the Hookman, and it adds massively to this game's tension. The Hookman, however, isn't invincible, as his weakness is seemingly bright flashes of light, as a flash of lighting from a nearby window exposes his true form, allowing Leon to land some shots on him, and after a long and desperate fight, Leon finally manages to take down the Hookman, as the game's demo then concludes. And man oh man, the Hookman demo of RE4 is seriously some of the coolest cancelled video game footage I have ever seen. I adore its atmosphere, its sound design, and even its more psychological tone. Just looking to the franchise as a whole, I'm not sure any release in this series can even match this 5-minute demo in terms of its psychological nature, and that's pretty sad, as I would love to see a Resident Evil game truly tackle that style of horror. And it's safe to say, Resident Evil as we know it would have been very different had this been the version of Resident Evil 4 we received. Although, for how great it looks and sounds, there was a few problems behind the scenes with the Hookman demo. For one, its genius dual world loading mechanic would actually be its undoing. While great in a gameplay and horror sense, it was an absolute nightmare for the GameCube hardware to run, and I doubt it could be supported for a full release, as just loading up 2 rooms simultaneously used the GameCube's entire 24 megabit RAM capacity, before even introducing any enemies on screen. Programmers at most could have 1 enemy on screen given these limitations. And secondly, there wasn't really a story to this game. The Hookman demo was cancelled before a script could even be finished. But just like the Castle demo, Leon will be infected with a virus that then causes him to face these paranormal monsters. But little else of a plot was created or made, and in late 2003, the Hookman demo would sadly be abandoned. With the cancellation of the Hookman demo, Yasuhisa Kawamura left the development team altogether, and there was growing concerns within Capcom about the future of Resident Evil 4. Considering the title had started development over 3 years ago, its troubled development cycle wasn't a great sign. One final scrapped version of the would-be RE4 was proposed, dubbed the zombie version. This prototype saw a return to something more familiar for the series, as a zombie-like creature known as the Daba Man would be introduced. The Daba Man would later become the Ganados seen in the released version of RE4. Outside of this creature, little information is known about the intended setting of this game, and no concept art is known to have been made. With the beginning of the zombie version of RE 3.5, then director of the project Hiroshi Shiobata would be dismissed and Shinji Mikami would take the reins as this game's director, and he would see it out into release. With Shinji at the wheel, the zombie version was cancelled, as he felt it was far too rudimentary for what they were trying to do with RE4. No known physical work was ever produced for the zombie version, and after a lengthy and troubled development cycle, during E3 2004, Capcom would proudly showcase a gameplay demo of the Resident Evil 4 we know and love. featuring Leon S. Kennedy's new redesign and its over-the-top action horror gameplay. And of course, Resident Evil 4 would go on to be one of the greatest Resident Evil games of all time, and one of the greatest video games ever released. It fundamentally changed the game's industry due to its over-the-shoulder camera and its incredible game design. It also then became the blueprint for Resident Evil going forward, as on from 2005, when it released, the series would see a very new, action-heavy tone present in its games for the guts of a decade. And for a game to be so huge, so loved, and so revolutionary, it makes sense as to why it had such a messy development cycle. And frankly, if you know game development, it's a miracle that after all of this mess, Resident Evil 4 came out the other side.
Well, I really don't give a damn. Rain or shine, you're going down.
Looking at RE4's many cancelled versions, it is a true shame some of these concepts were never revisited in either the full release or eventual remake. I and many other fans would have loved to see a more psychological tone and the infamous Hookman creature realised in the game. But all we can do for now is look back on what could have been and be grateful for what we got. Resident Evil 1.5. Hot off the heels of the highly successful Resident Evil, Capcom had quickly started to develop a multitude of sequel games to follow up on their horror classic. And while a development cycle for a PS1 game is noticeably short compared to modern standards, Resident Evil 1.5, the cancelled version of RE2, would go through many different challenges and changes as it was developed. It initially had a firm release date of March 1997, which is just about a year after the original game released. However, in early 1997, the team at Capcom were pretty dissatisfied with the quality of the title and how it was all turning out. In this initial stage of development as well, producer Shinji Mikami often had many creative differences with the game's director Hideki Kamiya, and frankly, the team decided to cancel the game and rebuild it, instead of releasing the game they don't care for. And after its cancellation, RE 1.5 would go on to become a bit of a legend in the Resident Evil community. Builds of this forgotten game have been found, which is how we can see how different this release was from the actually released RE2. It is unconfirmed exactly how finished the game was before its cancellation. Various developers have stated all sorts of different progress amounts over the years, from the game being just 40% complete, 60% complete, to even 80% complete. Although we don't truly know how accurate any of these amounts are. Looking into the builds we have found, I find Resident Evil 1.5 to be just fascinating. The game, of course, features rookie cop Leon S. Kennedy as one of the game's scenarios, along with a motorbike-loving badass lady to go along as the game's second scenario. However, unlike the sister to Chris, Claire Redfield, initially the game's second protagonist would be Elza Walker. Elza can be seen sporting a motorbike suit and a blonde ponytail. Her attire is a reference to her love for motorbike racing. She is also a college student, just like Claire. And before the ties to Chris Redfield were added to this character, Elza is seen in Raccoon City as she heads to enroll in its university. Funny enough, in the remake of RE2, there was a bonus DLC costume for Claire that referenced Elza's design. Elza is easily the most iconic part of this cancelled version of the game. However, she would later be redesigned in the Claire Redfield, as to give this game's story a bit more of a connection to Resident Evil 1. Outside of Elza, other scrapped and altered characters can be found in RE 1.5. Ada Wong was initially known as Linda, however it's possible this was simply a codename in development. The only other noticeable difference with Ada in this version of the game is that in addition to her double agent role, she is also a scientist. Seen in Elza's campaign, John and Roy were two scrapped characters that Elza was meant to encounter. John is simply a civilian seeking refuge from the zombie outbreak within the RPD. In development and through the game's redesign, he was altered and changed and would eventually become Robert Kendo. And as for Roy himself, he would be another RPD police officer Elza can encounter, similar to that of Marvin. He would also suffer the same fate as Marvin later into the game. All other characters seen in RE2 were here in some shape or form and mostly unchanged, with the whole Birkin family serving the same role they did in the release title. And Marvin was also set to play a much larger and more involved role in the game's story. Interestingly enough, in the very early development stages of this title, Leon S. Kennedy was actually named Grant Bittman. However, this was quickly changed to the name you now know. As for the game's scenarios, these have two wildly different starts compared to the released version of RE2. Leon's scenario starts with him already at the RPD, as he is seen on the roof of the building defending it from zombies. Whereas the actual release of the game, of course, has Leon arriving for his first day on the job in Raccoon City. Elsa's scenario also starts off much different to Claire's, with Elsa crashing her motorcycle through the RPD's main doors and locking up behind herself. Another huge change to this game's story and scenarios is that Leon and Elsa do not meet at all throughout the game, as their unique supporting characters fill those roles. With both scenarios set up, delving now into gameplay, through exploring the RPD itself, you can begin to notice how different things look in this version of the RPD. It appears much more modern and has a far greater, more realistic take on an American police station, whereas the version we got was a refurbished museum with all of its many quirks and features. In this 1.5 version of the RPD, its realistic design causes it to feature a very different design and flow from the released version, which was actually a criticism from Shinji Mikami of RE 1.5. He was said to be very critical of the gameplay and locations as he thought they were dull and boring, which would lead to its cancellation and redesign. As for the infected seen in RE 1.5, there was a few differences compared to its full release. For one, zombies would appear much more gruesome and unrelenting. Even with their heads decapitated or their legs blown off, these zombies could still attack the player, which is a pretty cool evolution on from RE1's slow moving zombies. Outside of zombies, generally all of the same bioweapons are featured here, with two exceptions, those being the man spider and the infected gorillas. I love the concept of both of these scrapped creatures so much, and it's a real shame they weren't seen in the game's release. As for the weaponry players could use to dispatch the undead, RE 1.5 features some noticeable changes compared to RE 2's arsenal. Leon's iconic pistol, the Matilda, would instead be replaced with the Browning High Power, the RPD's service weapon of choice. Elsa herself finds a Sig Sauer P228. Much later in the game, both characters could acquire burst-fire handguns. A standard shotgun was also available to both Elsa and Leon, and as for exclusive weapons, Elsa could find a grenade launcher, and for Leon, hand grenades were also seen here. A second more powerful shotgun could also be found later in the game. This weapon seems to be modelled after the Spaz 12, a very iconic movie weapon. Rounding out this game's arsenal of weapons, you have your typical Resident Evil magnums, and even an assault rifle. Healing items were also said to be very different in this version of the game, with glass vials of coloured medicine replacing the herbs seen in the previous game, although functionally these acted the same way as herbs. In addition to these health items, there was another scrapped gameplay addition, as armour could be found throughout the RPD. Armour was an item that could be equipped, allowing the player to take additional damage before dying. While many of these scrap mechanics, weapons and items sound pretty cool, in the end these were all tossed out with the cancellation of RE 1.5. And when the game was being redesigned into the RE2 we know and love, I find it interesting how this release essentially set up the rest of the franchise as we know it. Initially, it seemed like Shinji Mikami wanted to end off the series with this game's story. However, other developers at Capcom didn't agree with this choice, and as to future-proof the franchise, Yoshiki Okamoto, a producer at Capcom, proposed the creation of a fictional universe that would turn Resident Evil into a long-running series, in which self-contained stories with common elements could be told through additional installments, which basically set up the franchise as we know it. So with the game's script rewrote multiple times, and the game's design changed overall, in early 1998, Resident Evil 2 would release for the PlayStation 1, and it felt like a true sequel to Capcom's iconic zombie horror game. RE2 is arguably one of the greatest survival horror games of all time. It features a very memorable cast of characters, and the iconic Raccoon City and RPD station serve as a gorgeous backdrop for its zombie story. And that is a result of Capcom not wanting to sacrifice quality to release the game quickly, and admitting that a game isn't turning out the way you want, and starting again is a very big and tough decision, which in this case, I believe worked out in Capcom's favour. Biohazard Apocalypse. Biohazard Apocalypse is the first fully cancelled game on this iceberg, and it's pretty clear as to why this release never came out. We initially learned about this title from the massive data breach that happened to Capcom back in 2020, which I'll refer back to a few times throughout this video. This leak that Capcom suffered revealed a ton of upcoming titles they were developing, with many of these games not even being announced yet, and one of these titles was Biohazard Apocalypse. Initially, many fans took this as the next mainline entry for the franchise, and well, that was what Capcom had planned for this entry. All that could be initially learned about this title was that it was set to release in the third quarter of 2023, and that it was rumoured to be an open world online game. However, this didn't happen as it was cancelled. The next appearance of Biohazard Apocalypse would come from Capcom themselves, as in the build-up to the launch of Resident Evil Requiem, multiple videos were published with the game's director, Koshi Nakanishi, detailing new info and behind-the-scenes facts for the upcoming game. And in the very first video of these, Nakanishi mentioned Biohazard Apocalypse, along with showing some scrapped in-development gameplay. Here, Nakanishi addressed the rumours of an open-world online multiplayer game, and states that for a period of time, Capcom did work on a title like that. However, Nakanishi and Capcom themselves felt like this wasn't a title that fans wanted to see, and the game was scrapped. The small amount of released footage for this title I find to be really fascinating. A couple of reused assets from the RE2 remake can be seen in the game's weapons, and the gameplay shows players working together and fighting against groups of zombies. Although it seems rather generic to me. No story details or general setting were ever given for this title, and I do think it was a good thing that the title was cancelled. And it's like Nakanishi said, in my own opinion, this isn't the type of game fans want, especially as the next mainline game in the franchise.
仕切り直した結果、今のバイオハザードレクイエムというのが生まれました。
With Biohazard Apocalypse wrapped up, that is every game that is held in the Iceberg Sky layer. These are the most commonly known cancelled Resident Evil games that I'm sure many of you know of. The next layer we are descending down to, the surface layer, features 4 games, all of which have been shown off publicly to some degree. However, there is a bit of obscurity to these games, which will only continue on as we descend more layers on the iceberg. Resident Evil 0 N64. Starting development in summer of 1998, Capcom wanted to bring a brand new Resident Evil title to the Nintendo 64 as a console exclusive, which was a first for the series that would normally release on the PlayStation. This will be done to strengthen Capcom's already strong ties to Nintendo. Initially, the N64 hardware was chosen as the game's platform, but the recently announced Nintendo 64 disc drive attachment did have Capcom consider releasing a Resident Evil game for that accessory. However, that hardware received multiple delays, and upon its release, it didn't meet very good sales. So Capcom chose to solely develop for Nintendo's N64 cartridge system. Early on in development, this title would be pitched as a prequel to the original game, and was appropriately dubbed Resident Evil 0. Tatsuya Minami would see this title out as a producer on it. He then hired Koji Oda to direct the game. And with the N64 hardware, an interesting new gameplay mechanic was pitched here, as the idea of being able to swap between 2 characters on the fly in real time was proposed, which was dubbed zapping. This wasn't possible on disc-based hardware due to CD reading time limitations, but with the N64's cartridge, that wasn't an issue. RE0 was first shown off at Tokyo Game Show in April of 2000. There, attendees could play a small demo that featured the intro to the game, with Rebecca Chambers fighting her way through the Ecliptic Express train, as well as introducing the game's secondary protagonist, Billy Cohen. However, this demo is where some cracks began to show for RE0 on the N64, as it was noted that the demo experienced major slowdown issues during encounters with the Cerberus enemy. By this point in development, the game was set to be roughly 20% complete. However, RE2 director Hideki Kamiya has commented that the progression was more like 10% complete. Here, limitations of the N64 hardware began to show. The available memory on N64 cartridges was really limiting the devs on what they could do. The game was also initially slated to release that same year in 2000. So with its release date looming overhead and hardware issues getting in the way, Capcom would soon get the answer to this predicament they were in, as Nintendo announced their next generation hardware, the Nintendo GameCube, in that same year. So for the time being, Capcom chose to shelve RE0 on N64 and pick it back up again on new hardware, as the title would then be released in 2002 for the GameCube. The N64 version of RE0 only really showed the game's intro sequence on the train, which RE0's GameCube release would mostly keep with some alterations. What was planned beyond the train is unknown. However, we were able to learn more scrapped concepts and mechanics that were planned for the N64 version. We learned this through Capcom's developer diary for the game, as in the lead up to RE0's HD remasters, the game's original director Koji Oda and RE Revelations producer Tsukasa Takanaka will present a look back at an old build of RE0's N64 version. And through this developer diary, we can learn many interesting tidbits about this scrapped version of the game. It was planned that players could finish the game with only one of the protagonists being alive, meaning if Rebecca died, players could continue on and beat the game as only Billy. However, that of course had to be changed, as this was a prequel game, and Rebecca appears in the next chronological entry. There was also several scrap concepts put forward to make zombies more of a threat in this game. The devs, for one, wanted to have zombies react to players' guns more. I believe this concept is what was then used in RE4, where players could shoot enemies in certain parts of their body to trigger specific reactions. Running zombies, much like Crimson Heads seen in the RE1 remake, were also discussed for this game, but never implemented. Resident Evil 0 on the N64 will always be one of the cooler oddities from this franchise. We did still get this release, and it proved to be a rather divisive entry in the series, although me personally, I do really enjoy Resident Evil 0, and I've always had a soft spot for this game. While the N64 version of RE0 is a cool piece of history, I'm glad it was shelved in favour of the GameCube version we would later receive.
The name is Rebecca Chambers, but that's Officer Chambers to you.
Resident Evil Portable. At E3 2009, a brand new Resident Evil game was announced at Sony's press conference. Presented by Jack Tretton, then Sony CEO, Resident Evil Portable was announced and shown off to the world. This title was set to be an exclusive to PSP release and was described as an all-new Resident Evil experience designed specifically for PSP platforms. It was slated to release in the following year of 2010. However, after this E3 announcement, no further information on the title was ever shared, which I find particularly strange. If the game was slated to release within a year, for it to just fall apart and be cancelled like that, I find rather odd. Perhaps it was actively suffering through development issues even when it was first announced, or maybe the deal between Capcom and Sony fell through. However, we will never know. The only visuals we have of this title is the announcement image that was shared at E3, which looks like a rather generic Resident Evil logo with a bunch of zombie silhouettes surrounding it. I assume this was just used to present the title and not final art of the game.
I'm pleased to announce that Resident Evil will be coming to PSP next year in a whole new game designed specifically for the PSP platform.
Resident Evil 6.5. Following the release of Resident Evil 6, the Resident Evil franchise was in a bit of a rough spot critically. The more action-heavy focus present in the series that had started way back with RE4 in 2005 had really overstayed its welcome for many fans. And as the action elements increased and increased with each subsequent release, this caused Capcom to hard pivot and really rethink what a Resident Evil game was. And in 2017, we would get Resident Evil 7, a true return to form for Resident Evil, as the game was a scary as hell survival horror title. And that, in my opinion, was the best possible outcome going on from the likes of RE6's over-the-top action. However, the survival horror focused visit to the Baker family home wasn't Capcom's first concept for the next mainline RE game. In fact, there was a few of them. One of the more notable ones is Resident Evil 6.5, which was set to be a continuation of RE6's gameplay style and story. The title was set to be directed by Eiichiro Sasaki, the director of both Outbreak games, as well as RE6, which explains a lot about this game's concept and design. Two pieces of concept art for RE 6.5 actually got published a while ago by artist Sergei K, who had worked on concept art for numerous Resident Evil titles before this one. Within this art, we could see that the game would take on a third-person, over-the-shoulder camera style like RE6. The game's main protagonist seemed to be Leon Kennedy, and it was reported that Sherry Birkin would be featured alongside him. Leon's design here in the concept art I'm a big fan of, as in one screen he is seen with a large brown jacket, and the next he is wearing a tactical vest. Further details on RE 6.5 were published by known Resident Evil leaker Dusk Gollum, which I know he can be a bit of a divisive character and his info isn't always correct. However, multiple other publications such as Kotaku have reported on the same info, so at best, take this all with a grain of salt. It was believed that RE 6.5 would see Leon and Sherry head to a fictional version of Venice, Italy, in which a new water-based virus would break out. This would then be brought into gameplay, as enemies in some way would be both of solid and liquid form, as well as water-based weapons being used to take them down. Additionally, story-based choices will be presented to the player throughout the game, much like the choices you can make in RE3 Nemesis. These would impact the story and how it all progressed. It's also alleged that this version of RE 6.5 did get somewhat far into development, with it reportedly being worked on for about a year, with a rough 30 to 40 minute demo of the game being playable, although no footage of this demo has ever surfaced online. Around about late 2013, early 2014 is when roughly this game will be scrapped in favour of Jun Takeichi's next Resident Evil title, which later released as Resident Evil 7, which is a title that really course corrected the entire franchise after what felt like a few years of steady decline. While the idea of getting more Leon and Sherry gameplay, as well as a cool new Italy setting, was rather cool, I'm all in favour of its cancellation, given RE7 came out of it. Resident Evil 8.5. I previously talked about Biohazard Apocalypse, which was a cancelled game that was set to be Resident Evil 9. However, this entry is much closer to the actual release of RE9, but it does feature some big differences. Resident Evil 8.5 was revealed during Capcom's Resident Evil showcase in January of this year. To open the showcase, RE Requiem director Koji Nakanishi plays a "I told you so" sort of joke, as he had many fans believe that Leon wasn't going to appear in RE9. He previously stated in a developer diary months prior that Capcom had attempted to make a horror-focused title with Leon as the main protagonist, and that game didn't work out, which is what RE 8.5 was. And here at the Resident Evil showcase, we actually get a look at the game up and running. We get to see Leon move through a few environments. Much of the locations seen here seem like the intro section and Renwood Hotel from RE9, although the design and layout is noticeably different. Leon's design here also appears changed compared to how he looks in RE9. He does feature a black leather jacket, but this one is different to his RE9 jacket, with a lack of fur seen on the jacket, as well as overall looking like a much slimmer coat. He is also seen holding the Requiem revolver. But RE 8.5 was set to be a purely horror-focused game, and Nakanishi, along with the rest of Capcom, felt like it would be too hard to make an experienced character like Leon Kennedy scared of your average enemy encounters and bioweapons, given he's been fighting BOWs for the guts of 30 years. The core idea of having Leon in the next installment would stay, so RE 8.5 was shelved, and instead it was reworked into Resident Evil Requiem. Grace Ashcroft would be created as she would fill the horror-focused role Capcom were after, and Leon would enter his usual action-packed role for the later half of the game. It's unclear how far into development RE 8.5 would go. The only known footage from this version is what was shown at Capcom's RE showcase. The end result of all this being Resident Evil Requiem I'm alright with, as the concept of a horror-focused game with a veteran Leon at the reins does seem somewhat redundant, and I'm glad Capcom realised this. And that concludes the surface layer of the iceberg. All of those titles I discussed were at some point shown off publicly. However, many of their details are a little harder to find, and that is only the start of it, as we now will descend the layer of the iceberg, which brings us into the shallows. The games featured here are much more obscure than the former layer. Several of these games were never acknowledged in any official capacity, and we only know of their existence due to the leaks Capcom experienced, as well as leakers in the RE community. So going forward, for most of this layer on the iceberg, please take a lot of the information I say with a grain of salt. Resident Evil Revelations 3. Now this is a game I'm sure many of you wish wasn't on this list of cancelled Resident Evil games, as the Revelations sub-series of RE games certainly has its many fans. However, I wouldn't say that a Revelations 3 is definitely cancelled or never going to happen. The information for this title is extremely scarce and isn't 100% verifiable, as a lot of the info we have on this game comes from Dusk Gollum over on Twitter, so I will just briefly mention what this cancelled RE game was supposed to be. And of course, like I said, please take this info with a large grain of salt. It's alleged that pre-production on this game started in 2017. This game would see Rebecca Chambers return to the main stage for the first time in over 20 years. It's also alleged that a body and face model were chosen for Rebecca sometime in 2019. The game was set to take place within a university, where a virus suddenly breaks out, causing Rebecca to search for supplies and resources to fight the undead all over again. All while the university's principal was seemingly in on everything from the very beginning. Gameplay was set to be very alike the prior two Revelations games, with Rev 3 having a focus on survival horror and it taking shape as a third-person over-the-shoulder game. As is the nature with the Revelations titles, I assume this game would have been more AA in budget and scope, as were the prior entries in the sub-series. It's also alleged that with this release, it was prioritising the Nintendo Switch as its main release platform, with it being ported to all other consoles, which again makes sense, as both of the other Rev games have also appeared on handhelds. However, the project wasn't turning out great, and Capcom, not happy with the current state of the game, decided sometime in 2022 that it was best to scrap the release altogether. However, all of that information, like I said, was gathered from Dusk Gollum, so please take it all with a huge grain of salt, like I am. Personally, I would love to see more Revelations games. I think with how long modern games development cycles are, I think it would be great to have these cheaper, small-scale RE games release in between the big ones. I also think it's a great idea to bring back characters itching for a new appearance, such as Rebecca herself, and I do hope to see the Revelations series make a comeback eventually. Resident Evil Outrage. In addition to Revelations 3, there was actually a supposed side game that was set to be added onto it as an overall package, similar to how RE3 Remake was being bundled with RE Resistance, and this extra side game was set to be titled Resident Evil Outrage. This title does have a bit more credible info than Revelations 3, as the title was actually named in the Capcom data breach that occurred back in 2020, which oddly Revelations 3 wasn't featured in. Here, the game was initially slated for a Q4 2021 release. Additional info for this title will be leaked by DC Douglas, the voice actor for Albert Wesker in Resident Evil 5. He shared that Albert Wesker was set to feature in this game. However, doing this broke his NDA and caused Capcom to fire him, which is probably for the better. There was also leftover files found on the back end of both RE-verse and RE4 Remake which points to this game. Outrage was set to take place in 2003, shortly following on the events of Code Veronica. It would follow Albert Wesker and show us what he got up to after that game's conclusion. Wesker was seemingly given the alias of Michael Baxter, and the game's plot centered around him being saved by a woman called Yuri, which leads to Wesker becoming involved in with a crime syndicate known as the Scorpio. The game was set to release in chapters over the course of 6 months, which is a similar release strategy to Revelations 2, only over a longer period of time. However, in late 2021, this game was cancelled. It's unclear how much work was ever done for this title outside of its brief plot synopsis, although I would love a Wesker-focused game to show what happened to him between Code Veronica and RE5. However, Resident Evil Outrage wouldn't become that. Biohazard Hunk. Now here is a title that feels long overdue to happen. However, it now may never come to fruition. Resident Evil Hunk first appeared in the Capcom data breach of 2020, much like Outrage. In that data breach, the game was actually referred to as Resident Evil Hunk. However, it's common for anything involving Hunk to be incorrectly titled Hank, purely due to Japanese to English translation issues. This title was slated for release in Q4 of 2024. Little information is known on this title, and there was never any leaked images relating to this project. However, it seemed like this game would be a AA title similar to the Revelations games that would see Hunk as the game's main protagonist, which sounds incredible. However, since it is on this list, we know that we won't be seeing that. It's unclear when the title was abandoned and what stage of development it was at. However, it still stands that Hunk is a fan favourite Resident Evil character who I would personally love to see get a full game about him, and it's pretty sad to hear about this title's cancellation, but I'm hopeful with Hunk's recent appearance in both Resident Evil 9 and supposedly Code Veronica Remake that maybe Capcom do have an interest in the character. So hopefully, going forward, we will see a title like this surface. Resident Evil Online. Changing things up from all of the data breach titles, this entry on the iceberg will pull us back to a very different time for Resident Evil, as we are brought back to the late 1990s. Shortly before the release of Resident Evil 2, a producer at Capcom, Noritaka Funimizu, developed a small prototype of what a multiplayer Resident Evil game could be like. The concept was essentially a horde mode with up to 4 players trying to survive. However, initial playtests saw many players just opt to leave their teammates behind in order to survive themselves, which was a major issue for a cooperative multiplayer game. Much of the early info on this first concept game was revealed in 2002, when Noritaka Funimizu would speak to Famitsu magazine about the forgotten game. Funimizu was pushed to pursue a Resident Evil Online game by Shinji Mikami himself. However, this was still a very early time for the internet, and with the results of the early playtests, the prototype was shelved and Funimizu went on to work on RE3 Nemesis. However, the idea of a multiplayer Resident Evil game that saw players team up in order to survive the undead did catch Capcom's interest. So in mid-2000, the idea was revived with Noritaka Funimizu being involved. The new project aimed to put a greater focus on team cooperation, as to avoid the same fate as the prototype from the 90s. And during its initial pre-production, this Resident Evil multiplayer game was planned to feature a whopping 41 scenarios. Barely 1/4 of this number would ever make it to a release title. but I admire Capcom's sheer ambition here. This multiplayer project was first announced on February 13th, 2002 at the PlayStation Meeting event. This was a press-only event that focused on the online functionality of the PS2. Many trailers were shown at this event, including a trailer for this multiplayer project, first shown as Network Biohazard, an ambitious Resident Evil project that was truly ahead of its time. Just a few months later, the world would get its first full look at this new Resident Evil game, as during Sony's E3 press conference, a full trailer would debut for this game, which included its Western title of Resident Evil Online. This trailer shows us that the game will take place in Raccoon City with a whole new ragtag cast of characters. This trailer showed what Resident Evil Online was trying to be, as it had players working together in order to survive the horrors of Raccoon City's outbreak. This concept and its reveal trailer proved to be rather impressive, and Resident Evil Online quickly gained high interest from critics and fans alike. However, behind the scenes, things were far from smooth, and in 2003, Capcom were faced with two issues becoming apparent as the game was being developed. The game's very ambitious nature would be the cause of both of these issues. Firstly, Resident Evil Online was set to release later on in that same year in Japan, and secondly, the PlayStation 2's disk capacity was a mere 4.7 gigabytes, which proved far too small for the amount of planned content and scenarios. So cutbacks quickly had to be made, and when Resident Evil Online was next shown, it would be now known as Biohazard Outbreak, and at Tokyo Game Show 2003, a playable demo was present, which featured a mere 5 scenarios for players to play through, a far cry from the original planned 41. The game would then release as Resident Evil Outbreak worldwide in 2004, with a huge amount of cut content. To make up for this, in that same year in Japan, a sequel game was released, titled Resident Evil Outbreak File 2, which would then go overseas in early 2005. This release was more of the same Outbreak, but with additional content and new improvements. But even with these two full releases, they only made up a total of 11 scenarios for players to experience, showing some of the most cut content I have ever seen for a Resident Evil title. And a good chunk of that cut content got pretty far into development. Much of it can actually be accessed through both Outbreak File 1 and 2 via the use of hacking devices. Unused characters such as Hunk can be found fully 3D modelled and animated, just sat there unused. Even more interesting is an unmasked version of the character can also be found. And I mean, Hunk is such a perfect character for a game like Outbreak, and it's a shame he didn't appear in either of them. And there was so much cut content between both of the Outbreak games that in fact, many fans began to refer to all of the cut content as Outbreak File 3 unofficially. And while Outbreak 1 sold alright and was received fairly positively, Outbreak File 2 failed to meet the same standard, and from then on, absolutely nothing has happened with the Outbreak games. Even despite Capcom attempting again and again at making a Resident Evil multiplayer work, they have had the answer to that question looking at them this whole time, as I would love a remake of the Outbreak games, or even just a simple remaster brought to modern consoles with improved netcode and quality of life features. But if they were to remake Outbreak, I would love to see some of the cut content from Network Biohazard featured in it. But as it stands, Resident Evil Online was a very ambitious idea that I feel got a good jab with the Outbreak games. However, due to the era of its release and the amount of cut content, the idea to me at least doesn't feel fully realised just yet.
Resident Evil.
Moving along now, we see that information and visuals for these cancelled RE games is becoming more and more scarce, and that is only going to continue as we now descend down into the depths layer. We are pretty deep into the iceberg now, and you can certainly feel it. This layer of the iceberg actually represents a lot of Capcom's fails to bring Resident Evil to handheld devices, as we see another 3 cancelled titles from the late 1990s. Resident Evil Game Boy Color. With the huge success of Nintendo's Game Boy, the games industry began to shift, as game publishers saw handheld gaming as a very attractive avenue to pursue, and Capcom was among these publishers. So in mid-1999, Capcom approached a British company known as HotGen Studios about potentially porting the original Resident Evil to the Game Boy Color. HotGen's sole goal with this release was to make this game as close as possible to the PS1 original. That meant getting all of that game's systems and mechanics working on the Game Boy Color. Now, some of the original game's mechanics did have to be altered to better suit the hardware, such as the ink ribbons being replaced with a new pause function, which was a better fit for the platform. HotGen also planned to have a greater variety in enemies present, as well as a booby trap disarming mechanic. So not only was this planned to be an extremely impressive port, but it was also seeing new additions added to the original game, which is why it's no surprise that there was major issues in its development. I mean, the team at HotGen somehow had to replicate a 64-bit 3D title on an 8-bit handheld, which is such an impossible task, especially given the strict time frame this release had to develop in. And despite the game appearing at E3 1999, it missed its winter release that year and slipped into the following. By January 2000, the game was still not ready to release, and after already missing a release deadline, HotGen hoped to see an extension to at least March of that year. However, when that time in March came, it would see the end of this project, as Capcom had cancelled the project, saying they were not confident that the product would have pleased consumers and Capcom themselves. And that's despite the game being allegedly 80 to 90% complete. Capcom instead chose to pursue a new standalone RE game for the Game Boy. That title would be developed by M4 Limited, which in the end released as Resident Evil Gaiden. As for this port of RE1, its story doesn't end with its cancellation, as 2 cartridges with the game's ROM files were found and restored by the community sometime in 2011, and just recently, late last year, a build of the game from when it was cancelled was preserved, which sees a nearly fully complete and playable version of the game. Now, some enemies, sprites and weapons don't work as fully intended, but this allows us to see and play a cancelled Resident Evil game from a very long time ago, which is so cool to me. Nearly 30 years after its cancellation, the community was still able to find and preserve this release. Looking at this preserved version of the game, I find it extremely impressive how close this game looks and appears to the original release. I mean, the inventory screen looks almost one-to-one with the PS1 original, and the backgrounds and environments are pretty spot on as well. Cutscenes and major story segments are also, to the best of their ability, replicated here, which for the hardware is a huge feat, and I really love the community effort it took to preserve this game forever. And I personally find this game to be a pretty cool piece of Resident Evil history. Resident Evil Game Boy Advanced. Not long before the release of Resident Evil Gaiden, the Game Boy Advanced swiftly made its arrival, and while that game never made it to this new platform, the GBA had caught the eyes of many developers. I mean, it was a much more powerful system compared to its predecessor, and despite Capcom's already messy history with handheld gaming, one studio would pitch multiple Resident Evil handheld games for the GBA to Capcom. And that team was Raylight Studios, an Italian-based group. Shortly after the studio's 2000s formation, they became a GBA development studio in 2001, and shortly after that, they would develop the Blue Roses graphics engine, a GBA engine that could allow for 3-dimensional graphics to run on the hardware. While nowadays, these demos can look like messes of textures and polygons, this was a handheld device in the early 2000s, making this wildly impressive for the time. One of Raylight's earliest demos they put together on their new engine was a version of Resident Evil on the Game Boy Advanced, which they pitched to Capcom via these screenshots and video demos. This was set to not be a straight up port of the game, rather it was a version adapted to better fit the GBA hardware. Only these screenshots and demo videos have ever been released for this title, so it's unclear how far into development this demo ever got. In the released images we got, we can see what looks to be the guardhouse, along with Plant 42's tentacles sticking through the floorboards. A group of zombies, along with Chris Redfield's model, are also seen here. As for the released footage from this title, these were just animation and model showcases, showing off the game's zombies moving about, as well as the Chris Redfield model dying. When Raylight went to Capcom with this pitch, it wasn't the best time to do so. By this point, Capcom had become pretty jaded with Game Boy ports and versions of Resident Evil games. So with little interest left in the platform for Resident Evil, Capcom decided to decline Raylight's offer, causing this weird little demo to fall into obscurity. However, this wasn't Raylight's only attempt at bringing Resident Evil to the Game Boy Advanced. Resident Evil 2 Game Boy Advanced. Unlike their first attempt, which seemed to only make it to the early stages of development, Raylight Studios' second attempt at a GBA Resident Evil game got much further along. In 2003, Raylight put together this playable demo of a Game Boy Advance port of Resident Evil 2. Unlike their first try, this release was seemingly meant to be a straight port of the PS1 original. In this gameplay demo video, it starts directly after the car crash that Leon and Claire get into, and the demo is purely meant to showcase how a lot of the same gameplay mechanics can run on the GBA hardware. Both Leon and zombies are fully 3D modelled and animated, with the series' famous pre-rendered backgrounds also seen here. the game's UI is also pretty spot on to the PS1 release. The demo's gameplay purely focuses on Leon moving around and killing a few zombies. Strangely, this short demo ends after Leon goes through a door, which cuts to a quick test animation from a Street Fighter game Raylight was also seemingly working on, although I find its inclusion here very odd and definitely unintentional. It's presumed that Raylight pitched this demo straight to Capcom Europe, but much like their first pitch, this game would see the same result. And while I find this RE2 port visually impressive for the hardware, Capcom had zero interest in bringing Resident Evil to the GBA, and Raylight's offer was declined. Although I see a lot of merit behind both of Raylight's games. This was a studio that really wanted to push the GBA hardware to its fullest potential, and after only being around for a few years, they were pitching Resident Evil games to Capcom, which I gotta respect. Although this is where Raylight's journey with Resident Evil would end. It's unclear how far this GBA port of RE2 got in its development, but it can be assumed it was a bit further on than the RE1 port. And as it stands, these will forever be just quirky little bits of RE history that Capcom chose not to pursue. After that strange period of scrapped handheld RE games, we now have finally made it to the deepest layer on the iceberg, the bottom. This layer is jam-packed with some of the most obscure cancelled Resident Evil games out there, and I'm sure you've never heard of many of these games before. Much of the games in this layer have very little info or any visuals revealed on them, and this one layer on the iceberg ranges a very large amount of Resident Evil history, with it featuring games from the late 90s up until the early 2010s. Let us now dive into this final layer on the iceberg. Biohazard 3 Ship Bio. Beginning in development in late 1997, Biohazard 3 Ship Bio was a new take on Resident Evil. Hideki Kamiya was tasked with producing this title, although he was initially asked to direct the game after his most recent work on Resident Evil 2, but he didn't want to pursue this role. However, this title, despite its name, has nothing to do with the actual Resident Evil 3 that was released. There was never any released visuals or gameplay for this title. However, all of the info we have from this title are pulled from tweets that Hideki Kamiya himself made. Kamiya began to work with Flagship, a subsidiary of Capcom, on Bioship. Given the mansion setting of RE1 and the urban streets of RE2, to keep things fresh, Kamiya wanted this title to be set in a very different locale. So eventually, a cruise ship was chosen as this game's setting, which is where the nickname Ship Bio comes from. Story and gameplay details for this one are pretty scarce, but what we do know is that the game's cruise ship has a very mysterious background to it, as the boat disappeared for many years, then reappeared as the player discovers it. The game's protagonist was supposedly set to be a brand new character and not a previous protagonist. However, we have zero info on what this character was meant to be like. This title would be very similar in graphics to RE2, using pre-rendered backgrounds and a similar control scheme. However, there was some experimentation done to try and make this title stand out compared to prior entries, such as 3D, fully poly environments being tested, but these didn't go far. And with how similar this title was to RE2, which Kamiya had just worked on, this is where things started to fall apart with this game. Kamiya grew disinterested in Bioship and wanted off the project, so he retreated into a planner position for the title. Kazunori Kodoi would then be brought on board, which Bioship's director, Masaki Yamada, was frustrated with the change in staff. This title wouldn't go too far beyond this mix-up and initial planning stage, as in mid-1998, Sony would announce their next console, the PlayStation 2, which was set to release in 2000. There was concerns at Capcom that releasing a new PS1 game close to the new console would impact the game's sales. Instead, Shinji Mikami opted to begin planning a brand new next-generation RE title for the PS2. He then met up with Hideki Kamiya and offered him a chance to work on this new Resident Evil title for PS2. And with the new technology, Kamiya felt like he could try new things and create something unique, which then led to Bioship being cancelled completely. Due to the PS2's hardware, all of the work that had been done for Bioship couldn't be carried over in any meaningful way. Kamiya then went to work on the next generation hardware game, which was of course RE 3.5 stylish, which as you know eventually became Devil May Cry. As for Bioship, it's unclear how far into development this title got, as all we actually have of the game is a few tweets from Kamiya. Nevertheless, I find this release interesting, as it's clear the setting of a cruise ship is something Capcom wanted to do for quite a while, which they would in fact do multiple times over the years. Biohazard Dash. The next entry on this iceberg is one that is very obscure and comes from such an early point in the franchise's history. The development timeline for this title is roughly after the first Resident Evil and before Resident Evil 2. To make its release date, the original Resident Evil had a fair amount of cut content. Feeling regretful of this, the team at Capcom had thought about revisiting what remained of the Spencer Mansion, which was then pitched as a new sequel game by Yoshiki Okamoto, a producer at Capcom. And that game would undergo the development title of Biohazard Dash. There were several ideas thrown around here for this release. The developers had thought to use the same environments seen in RE1, but with added cracks, cobwebs, and deterioration to indicate the passage of time, as well as new additional rooms being added to the mansion. There was also a new emphasis placed on creatures such as spiders and plant monsters being a large focus of this game. Biohazard Dash was meant to be an in-between title that released between RE1 and RE2, but the time it would take to develop RE Dash would have caused a delay for RE2, so it was ultimately canned, is what I would say. However, the story of Biohazard Dash is so much more complex than just that, and it's possible that everything I just said is true, except Biohazard Dash even being a thing, as over the years, this cancelled title has seemingly gained the status of internet urban legend. Many people got the idea that Biohazard Dash was actually a mistranslation from an interview with Yoshiki Okamoto. Many believe that the additions and areas he discussed were both new content that was set to be added to the Sega Saturn port of RE1, as well as planned content for RE 1.5, the original version of RE 2. And overall, I'm unsure on what I believe. I mean, if you look to Famitsu's weekly magazine from October 25th, 1996, Okamoto directly mentions the title that was meant to release in between RE 1 and RE 2, called Biohazard Dash, and mentions of returning to the Spencer Mansion don't seem like something that could be related to either an RE 1 port or RE 1.5. But I don't speak Japanese, so it's possible the English translation I just read to you is incorrect. But then again, it's also possible that Biohazard Dash was a project that only Yoshiki Okamoto had been involved with. Many members of the RE1 and 2 dev teams have been asked over the years about this title's existence, to which none of them can remember such a game. But whenever Okamoto was asked about it, he seemed extremely passionate about the title. The concept itself of exploring the Spencer Mansion post RE1 with a focus placed on insects and plant-based POWs is an incredibly cool concept, and this game's obscurity and internet legend history make this an even cooler cancelled Resident Evil game. I can't say for 100% certain that Biohazard Dash was a full RE game in development at a time, so I will leave it up to yourself as to whether you believe it or not. However, me personally, I do believe it was a real game. Rex, Resident Evil X. After the successful release of Dead Rising 2, Capcom acquired the studio behind the release, Blue Castle Games, and made them into a subsidiary of themselves, and they are now most well known as Capcom Vancouver. The studio, now acquired under Capcom, will continue to work on the Dead Rising series, and along with continuing that series, they also pitched a multitude of new IPs to Capcom, as well as pitching new titles for other Capcom properties. And the one I'm specifically looking at here is Capcom Vancouver's own Resident Evil title. Its development name was Rex, which stands for Resident Evil X, and little is known of this game. It's understood that Rex was meant to be an action-focused spin-off title similar in gameplay to Resident Evil 6. However, Capcom would reject this pitch, as dissatisfaction from critics and fans was growing, as the series had become very action-focused by this point in time. It's unclear how far Rex got in its development, and we have no visuals to see what this title may have looked like. And the only reason we have any knowledge of this title is due to this video by YouTuber Did You Know Gaming, as he interviewed many former Capcom Vancouver devs. I'll leave a link down below to that video as it's a great watch. Rex is a game that I'm sure many fans aren't going to miss, and I'm personally glad we have moved away from the action-focused era of Resident Evil. But it's hard not to wonder what exactly Rex would have featured and focused on for its plot and story. However, we will never know. Resident Evil 2 Sega Saturn. Not long after the release of Resident Evil 2 for the Sony PlayStation, Capcom wanted to bring their newest title to a wider variety of hardware, so they sought out other developers and platforms that they could then port their new horror game to, and one that ultimately never happened was a port of Resident Evil 2 for the Sega Saturn. Capcom partnered with Next Entertainment, a Sega subsidiary, as they would develop the port of RE2 for the hardware. However, things weren't so simple, and early into development of this port, Capcom began to lose faith in the title being possible, as the Sega Saturn hardware proved insufficient in running RE2, as it had a noticeable lack in quality comparable to the PS1 release. And Capcom, not willing to release a vastly inferior port compared to the original, shifted their attention away from this project, and it seemingly just faded into obscurity. However, talks between Capcom and Sega did continue, as they instead wanted to partner up and release a title better suited for a Sega console, and the upcoming Dreamcast seemed to be the perfect place for a game just like that, which is how the Sega Dreamcast port of Code Veronica came to be, as it all started as a failed RE2 Sega Saturn port, which I think is pretty neat. There was never any screenshots or development footage posted online that I could find for this project. However, in several Sega magazines, the RE2 port was mentioned, showing that there was a clear intention to release the title, at least before all of its development issues came to light. Untitled Slant Six game. At this stage in the iceberg, we've gotten to such an obscure point that these cancelled RE games no longer even have titles. Slant Six, a Canadian development team, had worked with Capcom to release the spin-off title Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City, which, fun fact, was the first ever RE game I played. Despite its poor reviews, it sold well enough that Capcom wanted to continue working with the team at Slant Six. This new title was seemingly pitched by Capcom to Slant Six themselves, and was a new Resident Evil game unrelated to Operation Raccoon City. Very little is known about this title or what it may have been like. However, it wouldn't go very far into development, as Slant Six Games would make a grave mistake. There was leftover assets and data found on the Operation Raccoon City's disc, which revealed that Slant Six at a stage was working on the next Star Wars Battlefront title, and with how easy it was to find these assets, it seemingly broke Slant Six's NDA with that title, which caused Capcom to rethink their partnership with Slant Six, and ultimately the new Resident Evil game they were working on was canned. And just over a year after Operation Raccoon City was released, Slant Six Games went bust and have been defunct ever since. And I find this whole situation with Slant Six to be very sad, as many of the devs were big fans of the Resident Evil series, and they never got to redeem themselves with a new RE game. This one little misstep caused the entire company to go under and lose out on big opportunities, which is an awful shame, and it seemed like Slant Six wanted to make a more survival horror focused RE game after Capcom themselves pushed Operation Raccoon City to be an action focused game, so it sucks that we never got to see Slant Six's next attempt at a Resident Evil title. Untitled Creative Assembly pitch. We now arrive at the final entry in this iceberg. Once again, it's another unnamed Resident Evil pitch. However, this one has a little more info and visuals than the last few games. Creative Assembly is a name that used to not mean too much, which could be why their Resident Evil pitch was rejected, which I'm sure Capcom now regrets, as Creative Assembly have went on to release and develop titles like Alien Isolation. This new RE game was proposed back in roughly 2012 or 2013, and we actually have some concept art from this game. Creative Assembly's concept artist, Brad Wright, created these 3 images, and then in 2015 he would upload them online to free up some space on his computer, although I believe it was purely just to show people what could have been. And this concept art I find very intriguing. It features series icon Jill Valentine. Her design here seems very reminiscent of her BSAA outfit from RE5. However, she now sports much longer hair and a gas mask slung on her side. There is an unnamed male character seen beside Jill, and many would probably jump to say that this is obviously Chris Redfield. However, I don't agree, as it looks nothing like him. Seen in this concept art collage is also a mysterious little girl in a pale white dress. In one image, she appears to be at a gathering of people. Many of the men seen in this image appear to be researchers or even military personnel. The final image in this collage is what seems to be the little girl receiving a blood transfusion, which has me so intrigued as to what exactly her purpose in this game's story is. Little else is known of this title. Presumably, it would have been a spin-off game featuring Jill Valentine. However, articles from 2015, when this concept art first surfaced, dubbed this title Resident Evil 7. However, that obviously wasn't what this game was. We also have no idea why this game was cancelled and how far into development it got. Perhaps Capcom didn't see these devs suitable for a survival horror game, which funny enough, Creative Assembly would next release exactly that, as the critically acclaimed Alien Isolation was released in 2014, which I'm sure is something that keeps Capcom executives up at night. I doubt that there was any crossover in ideas or mechanics between the cancelled RE game and Alien Isolation, but it stings a little knowing that these devs craft such a scary survival horror game at a time when Resident Evil as a franchise really needed exactly that. As sad as this game's cancellation is, it's not all bad. Creative Assembly just recently announced Alien Isolation 2, and it looks amazing. So I wish the team all the success in the world, as they have seemingly found a space in the survival horror world. just not through Capcom. And that was the cancelled Resident Evil games Iceberg explained. This was a massive undertaking, as the history of these cancelled Resident Evil games has spanned nearly the franchise's entire 30-year history, and I loved looking back on the many ways this franchise could have changed and how different some iconic RE games could have been. I feel like this Iceberg really puts into perspective how messy and complex games development can be, as projects get changed around, rewrote, or scrapped at a moment's notice. And the particular history of cancelled Resident Evil games I find to be really unique, from the 0.5 versions of actually released games to fully cancelled titles. Capcom has such a unique approach to games development. If a project isn't turning out the way they want, it can be changed again and again, turned into something else entirely different, or just scrapped, despite development time and costs, which is something I respect about the company and how they approach the RE series. Many of the games in this Iceberg I'm sure you know, but I hope there was at least a few of these cancelled RE games you hadn't heard about before, which is why I want to ask you what your favourite cancelled Resident Evil game is. Let me know down below, as I would love to hear it. As for me personally, this is such a hard thing to choose. I mean, RE 3.5, specifically the Hookman demo, is iconic and I adore its psychological approach and Leon's appearance. But then again, games like Revelations 3 or even RE 1.5 are also super cool cancelled RE games. And honestly, the story of Biohazard Dash was probably my favourite to look into. If you did watch this far into the video, I just wanted to thank you so much for doing so. These videos take a hell of a lot of time to make, and your guys' support really means a lot. If you are new here or haven't already, please feel free to subscribe to the channel, as it really means a lot. And in return, I'll keep putting out more Resident Evil and Silent Hill content just like this. You can also like this video if you want to see more Iceberg videos from me, as it lets YouTube know that people are liking this stuff. With all of that shameless self-promo out of the way, that will conclude this Iceberg video. I again want to thank you so much for watching this video, and I will hopefully see you on my next one. Peace.